Здравствуйте, меня зовут Анна Кириченко. Я рада приветствовать вас всех от имени международной образовательной компании «Прометин» на нашем первом в этом году вебинаре. И он будет посвящен открытиям нейронауки и о том, как эти открытия могут помочь учиться и учить. И у нас сегодня необычный вебинар. Мы пригласили доктора Джона Коллика, это глава Международного департамента стратегии образования Прометиан, и сегодня он расскажет о своих исследованиях и о том, как открытия в нейронауке могут помочь в образовании. Hello, John.
Hi, hello. Thanks for inviting me.
Здравствуйте.
I'm looking forward to this presentation.
Доктор Джон здоровается с нами и скорее хочет начать презентацию. Чтобы было удобно, мы сегодня поступим таким образом. Доктор Джон заранее записал видео, это такая 20 примерно минутная лекция. Мы наложили субтитры на русском языке, и можно будет одновременно послушать прекрасную английскую речь и видеть субтитры на русском языке, так что быть в курсе, что происходит, и быть уверенным, что правильно перевели то, что говорит доктор Джон. После видеозаписи доктор Джон будет отвечать на вопросы и давать ответы на то, что вы напишете в чате. Так что пишите смело. Сейчас уже можно начинать тестировать чат, написать откуда вы, кто вы, и заодно мы посмотрим, насколько обширна у нас география, потому что доктор Джон находится у себя дома в небольшом городе под Лондоном, я тоже у себя дома в Московской области. Ну, посмотрим, кто еще к нам присоединился. Ответы на вопросы у нас будут в прямом эфире, поэтому я буду помогать их переводить с русского на английский и, соответственно, обратно переводить ответы с английского на русский язык. Ну или вы можете писать в чате сразу на английском, если вам это удобно, и доктор Джон будет также в чате за чатом следить и отвечать, может быть, быстро в чате. Вот так мы сегодня будем работать. Надеюсь, это будет интересно. Смело задавайте вопросы, и мы будем искать вместе на них ответы. Наверное, можно уже включать видео.
Strategy at Promethean. Hello, my name's John Collick and I'm head of International Education Strategy at Promethean. Over the next 20 or 25 minutes, I want to talk about the latest discoveries in neuroscience and what are the implications for teaching and learning and education in general. To begin with, I want to talk about what are called neuromyths. Neuromyths are basically ideas about how the brain works and how we learn and think that are incorrect, but which are very popular and have been popular for many years. Even though many of these ideas have been disproved by the latest discoveries in neuroscience, they still tend to persist, particularly in the classroom. So it's very important to be aware of and to understand these ideas that are incorrect. So let's have a look at a few of them. The first neuromyth that is very common is this idea that we only use 10% of our brains. It's a little bit difficult to understand where this idea first came from. Some people think that it's a quotation that was originally made by Henry T. Ford or possibly Albert Einstein. Other ideas suggest that it may well have been doctors in the 19th century saying that because medical science is currently so primitive, we only understand what 10% of the brain does. And this then became changed into we only use 10%. It's completely false. We use all of our brain all the time. And as we will see later on in this presentation, the efficiency is a very, very important part of the brain. It always tries to use as much of it as efficiently as possible. The second one, and again this is very common, this began in the 1970s, is this idea that the brain is split into two halves, that the left side of the brain is logical and deals with language and numbers, and that the right side of the brain is creative and artistic and responds to music and shape and colour. Again, it's a very crude model. It has been disproved. This idea of left brain, right brain is wrong. Yes, the brain does have different parts and these different parts work in different ways, but it's far more complicated and interconnected than this simple model suggests. Another very common idea is this idea of learning styles. Now, the idea of learning styles is different people will learn in different ways. So some people may be visual learners, some people may be auditory learners, which means that they respond to sound and words. Some people may be kinesthetic learners, which means they respond to movement. Again, this idea has been disproved. It was disproved in the 1990s. And yet it still persists. When I'm doing presentations at conferences around the world, I often hear people talking about different learning styles. It is a typical neuromyth, and it has no basis in actually how the brain works. This, of course, is one of my favourites. The idea is that as we get older, we become more stupid, that our peak intelligence is probably when we are in our late teens or early 20s. And from then on, our ability to learn, to understand and to remember starts to deteriorate very quickly. We get worse at learning and remembering things. Again, this is a myth. Providing the brain does not suffer from any serious cognitive illness in later life, you can continue to learn and study, and the brain will continue to develop and change throughout your entire life. So this idea that once we hit 25 or 30, we should just give up, again, it's simply not true. So what have we learned? What have we learned over the last 20 or 30 years? Well, this is very important. Neuroscience, modern neuroscience, is very new. So it only really dates from the mid-90s or the early 90s with the introduction of what is known as magnetic resonance imaging, which allowed us to study the human brain while it thought, while it felt, while it operated, without having to do any surgery or intervention. So modern neuroscience and some of the things that I am going to talk about today only come out of the last 20 or 30 years of research. For that reason, it's important to understand that the picture may change. Certain things may be disproved or new ideas may come along. But this is the state of neuroscience, and these ideas I'm going to share with you are based on some of our latest understanding. The first one is basically about the structure of the brain. Now, we kind of knew this already, but the brain is made of millions and millions and millions and millions of brain cells. And brain cells tend to look like this. They're long, thin cells, and at the end of them they have a collection of branches, and these branches at the end have more little branches, and along these branches you have what are called neurons, which are like tiny nodules. And what happens is that when we think, a charge or a impulse, electrical impulse, goes down along these brain cells to the branches and to the neurons, and then it jumps to the next brain cell. So all of these brain cells are connected with each other, and that's basically how the brain is structured. Now, if we then go closer in and we look at the neuron itself, so these are little like bumps on the surface of the brain cell, and these are the points of connection between brain cells. Now, what happens when we have a thought is that an impulse, an electrical charge, goes down the brain cell and it comes to the end of the neuron, and there that impulse is converted into a chemical called a neurotransmitter, and that jumps the gap to the next brain cell, where that chemical is changed back into a charge and continues on its journey. Now, what happens is that if that impulse only goes down that neuron once or twice, so if it only jumps this gap once or twice, what will then happen is that gap will disappear. It will no longer function. It will cease to be used. Typically what happens is that the chemical between the neurons will persist for a couple of minutes, which is the length of short-term memory. However, if that gap, if that space between the neurons continues to fire, if it continues to happen, what will happen is that gap, that transmission will get faster and faster and more efficient until eventually the gap will physically close and it will become a permanent connection. Now there's a very useful way of thinking about this, and that's to think of the human brain as being like a forest or a wood. And if you walk through that forest once, then the path that you make will very quickly disappear. It will grow over. But if you continue to walk the same path day after day, week after week, then eventually that path will become permanent. And this is more or less how the brain works. By repeating the action or the thought or the idea or the learning process that created that first jump across the neuron connection, you will then reinforce that connection until it becomes a permanent physical link. And this, in a young person, will typically take about 2 weeks. If you can remember when you learned to ride a bicycle, it probably took you about 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks trying and falling off until eventually something happened. A connection was made inside your head and you could ride the bicycle. What actually happened was that those connections that you were continuing to make all the time became permanent physical connections in your head. And you will never forget that. You will never forget how to ride a bicycle. So, constant repetition of a connection between neurons creates a permanent anatomical change, this permanent link. And this happens, when this happens in the mind, it's not just a single connection, but it's an incredibly complicated pattern is created. And this pattern is called an engram. The technical term is engram. And these engrams, these permanent patterns of complex pathways inside the mind, create long-term memory. So this is very important. This concept of pattern creation is very important because the best way to think of the human brain is as perhaps the most sophisticated and powerful pattern recognition and pattern creation machine in the world, or the universe that we currently know. So the brain creates complex patterns all the time. Every day, every moment of every hour, all of the sensations that you have through your sight, through your hearing, through touch, through smell, through taste, through movement, through feeling, that all goes into your brain, and your brain uses it to create these incredibly complex patterns inside your mind. This is also the reason why we tend to recognize and respond to patterns very powerfully. Patterns, particularly simple patterns like faces, for example, we are evolutionarily designed to respond to them very quickly and to understand them and to recognize them and to see them very, very, very quickly. Now, so the first important thing to think is that the brain is a pattern creation machine. The second thing, and this is also very important, is that the brain is always trying to use as little energy as it can, but also at the same time be as efficient as it can. So minimum energy use, maximum efficiency. Those are the two rules that the brain works with. And the simple reason for this is that the human brain uses up an incredible amount of the body's energy. Even when the brain is simply resting and not doing anything in particular, it's using up to 20% of the whole energy consumption of the human body. And that's a huge amount. So obviously, because the brain is designed and evolved to keep us alive, it wants to try and use as little energy as possible to help us survive. This is one of the reasons why the brain will often do things or often work in ways that to the modern human seem odd or a little bit counterproductive or a little bit strange. But when you think of it in terms of this idea that it's trying to use as little energy as possible and to be as efficient as possible, then it does make sense. I'll give you a good example about memory and how the brain changes and organises memory to make them as efficient as possible. So let's imagine that you, as a child, when you were perhaps 5 years old, you went with your family to the seaside and you sat on a beach and you ate an ice cream. And what that did was, from all of the sensations, the taste, the sound of the waves, the feeling of the sun and the sight, it created a complex pattern inside your brain. And that became a memory. Now, the next year, perhaps you went to the seaside again. It may have been a different place. It may have been a different beach. You may have eaten another ice cream, but it may have been a different flavour. Now, what happens in this particular example is the human brain will look at the pattern that it was created when you were the year before, and it will look at the pattern that's being created now, and it will often say, okay, these patterns are so similar, I'm going to merge them into one single pattern. So instead of having two separate memories, you'll actually have a master memory that combines these two actual memories. And then guess what? Next year, you may go to the seaside again, you may go to a different beach, you may eat an ice cream again, and again, the brain will say, okay, well, I've got a master memory here of sitting on a beach eating an ice cream as a child, and this new pattern is almost the same. So again, I'll just merge them together. Now, this is very common. A lot of the memories that we have of, when we were young, we think that they are discrete actual memories. In fact, they're not. What they are is they're kind of meta memories. They're master memories that the brain has created for the sake of efficiency, combining a whole range of different experiences that may have happened at different times and in different places. But because the pattern is so similar, the brain's merged them all into one. Now, this can lead to a very interesting phenomena whereby you may go somewhere, you may have an experience, and you may think to yourself, I've been here before. I've done this before. Even if you know you haven't, even if you know this is a completely new place, you may go somewhere and think, hang on, this is all very familiar. And that's what we call deja vu. That feeling you've been somewhere before, even when you know you haven't. Now, what actually is happening inside your head is you've got a master pattern, a master memory pattern. And the experience you're having now is so similar or fits in so closely with that master memory that the brain is going, oh, well, we don't need to process this as something new. It's already in here. Let's use that instead for the sake of efficiency. That's why we get deja vu. Another phenomenon of this need to be efficient and save energy is what we call the detail boundary in memory. Now, people often find that they can remember things down to a certain level of detail. But beyond that, everything becomes a little bit blurry. It becomes difficult to focus on. Typically, this tends to happen with faces. We can remember people. We may remember people who've passed away, but we cannot remember their faces accurately. We cannot remember what they actually looked like as if it was a photograph. And this can often cause distress. There are two reasons why this is happening. Firstly, the brain will only remember to a point where it thinks it's useful, and it won't really think that it's particularly useful to remember the exact detail of everything you experienced and saw at an earlier date. There's no reason for it to do that. It's a huge waste of space, it's a waste of processing power, it's a waste of energy. So it only will remember down to a certain level. And again, secondly, it's because it's trying to create master memories all the time. So your memory of somebody who you no longer see is probably a composite memory of them of different places at different times, all merged into one. So instead of a detail, you have an archetype. And again, to us, it can be frustrating, it can be upsetting, but again, once you think of it in the context of the brain trying to save energy, trying to be efficient, it does make sense. So, that's some of the discoveries that we've learned, some of the things that we've learned in the latest developments with neuroscience. What are the implications for learning? Well, one interesting implication is that because the brain wants to be as efficient as possible, it can handle about 3 ideas simultaneously. We can hold 3 things in our heads simultaneously. Any more than that, then it becomes difficult. It becomes the energy consumption, the processing power increases, and the brain doesn't like that. The brain starts to struggle. This idea of multitasking is a myth. We can handle about 3 ideas at one time, but don't try and do any more. The second thing we also know is that higher order mammals learn by playing. The best way for us to learn is by playing, because when we are playing, when higher order mammals like cats and dogs and apes and humans play, they're practicing activities that will be useful to them for survival, that are then permanently being impressed in the brain. We respond best to playing to learn. The other thing, and this is very, very interesting, is that if we try and do something and we are successful, then there is a chemical inside the brain called serotonin. And serotonin is best thought of as being similar to the oil that helps the engine in your car operate more smoothly. Well, serotonin does the same thing to the brain. It improves our ability to learn and to remember. Now, if you do something and succeed, your serotonin level will go up a little bit. If you do something and fail, your serotonin level will increase much more, much, much more. So in actual fact, what this means is that we learn best by trying and failing because our serotonin level increases. So we really do need to encourage people to not be frightened of failure, not to think of failure as something negative, but of trying and failing and trying something new and failing and trying something different and failing. Each time this is an important learning process, and it's how the brain works. Another interesting point is that if we watch somebody else try something and fail, yes, their serotonin level will increase, their cognition will increase. Our cognition, our serotonin level also increases by watching other people fail. So failure is essential for learning. Numbers. Why do some people struggle with mathematics and numbers? There's again a reason for this. If you remember that I said that the brain can only handle 3 discrete concepts at the same time, this applies to numbers. And I'll give you a really good example of this. You can see 2 counting systems here that developed on different opposite parts of the world at more or less the same time. At the top is the Latin or Roman counting system for the numbers 1 to 4. And at the bottom is the Chinese and Japanese system for counting 1 to 4. You can see for 1 to 3, they're almost the same. 1 stick, 2 sticks, 3 sticks. Once you hit the number 4, you don't see 4 sticks, because once you have 4 separate objects, the brain processing starts to increase. The brain doesn't like it. It wants to be efficient. It doesn't want to have to think about 4 things. So instead, you have, for the number 4, in Latin and in the Chinese counting system, you have a separate symbol. On the other hand, although we may struggle with numbers, we do instinctively get ratios. We understand the idea of 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 1 to 2. And the simple reason for this is survival. Because our brains have evolved in order to keep us alive, often in a hostile environment, often in a situation where we may come across enemies or predators, then understanding ratios is actually important for survival. So we know that if we're walking through the jungle and we meet one enemy, then we have a 50-50 chance of surviving. If there's 2 enemies and 1 of us, we need to run away very quickly. If there's 3 of us and 2 enemy, then we know we can probably survive. We stand a better chance of survival. Ratios are embedded in our minds. We get them, we understand them instinctively. Numbers we struggle with. And this is interesting. For the human brain, the number line, the traditional number line which you see here, is something that we struggle to understand. Yet we teach this to children first before we teach them about ratios, which we instinctively get. If you look at some of the different communities around the world, and I'm thinking now of some of the native inhabitants of South America, here are 2 tribes. The Piraha tribe has a counting system that goes 1, 2 lots. That's their counting system. The Munduruku tribe has a counting system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lots. They don't count any higher. Again, they've never developed the number line. They've never developed the concept of negative numbers. They have never developed complex mathematics because they've never needed to. And the brain doesn't take to this naturally. Finally, and this is really, really important, one of the most important discoveries perhaps of the last 20 or 30 years of neuroscience is the importance of emotion. Emotion is perhaps one of the most important influences on how we understand and how we learn and how we remember. And again, it's all down to survival and efficiency. If you have a look at this picture here of a human brain, you'll see that small green blob. That is what we call the amygdala. And the amygdala is a small part of the brain that manages and controls our responses to stress and danger. Now, what happens is that when we are in a dangerous situation or stressful situation, the amygdala does 2 things. First thing it does is it sends a signal down to the rest of our body to prepare us for fight or flight. So it will increase our adrenaline, it will increase our blood rate, it will increase our breathing, it will tense us, it will get us ready to cope with the situation. At the same time, and this is what we've discovered, at the same time, the amygdala will send a message up to the brain telling it to stop thinking. Stop thinking. Stop conscious thought. Essentially, what it does is it deliberately makes us stupid. Why? Well, the reason is very simple. It's survival. If the brain wastes time thinking, if it wastes energy and time thinking, it's probably too late. The amygdala doesn't want you to think, it wants you to survive. And so it shuts down your brain, your higher thought processes, and next thing you know is a few moments later, you come back to consciousness and you realize that you've run 100 yards down the path away from the danger and you don't remember any of it. So the amygdala suppresses thought, triggers the stress response, but more importantly, it also remembers. It will remember the situation to try and make it happen quicker next time. Now, the problem that we have with the amygdala is designed for hostile environments that of 100,000 years ago. It's not designed for modern living. The other problem the amygdala also has is that it cannot tell the difference between an immediate life-threatening situation, like you have here, and constant low-level daily stress. It sees all of it as a threat. So if we expose children or we expose ourselves to constant low-level daily stress, what is happening is that stress is triggering the amygdala, which in turn is suppressing our ability to cognate, to our ability to think. So basically what this means is that stress And negative emotion physically reduces the brain's ability to think. If we want to make sure that we have the optimum, best environment for teaching and learning, we have to make sure that those environments are safe and happy. Happy children learn best. Unhappy, stressed, or frightened children struggle. And this is not, this is an actual biological fact. There's a biological reason for this. So, over the last 20 minutes, last 25 minutes, I've introduced you to some of the latest discoveries in neuroscience and tried to talk a little bit about some of the implications of these discoveries on teaching and learning. There are some basic principles that we can learn. Short reward cycle. The brain responds quickly to short reward cycles to keep it engaged and interested. Playing. We learn best by playing. We should embrace failure. Failure helps improve our cognition, helps improve our understanding. We get patterns, we get ratios, but more than we get things like the number line. So perhaps we need to think about swapping our mathematics curriculum around a little bit to make it fit in more with the natural way the brain thinks. And finally, and perhaps the most important thing, is that emotional security and safety and a lack of stress or fear is the optimum environment for teaching and learning. So I hope you found this interesting. It's a continually changing and developing scientific field. There'll be many, many more interesting and fascinating discoveries to come, all of which I think will have a profound impact on the way we teach and the way we learn. Thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, John. Thank you so much, John, for
You're welcome.
that report about neuroscience research and how it could help to teach and learn. And here I get some questions. Спасибо большое, я сказала Джону от всех нас. И сейчас я буду зачитывать вопросы, которые вы оставили в YouTube. И пишите, пожалуйста, если они у вас еще есть. Я буду переводить, так что можно писать на русском, на английском, так как вам это удобно. И so, John, just to let you know that here is not only people not only from Russia, but from Kazakhstan as well.
Okay, cool.
And first question. И первый вопрос о том, как думают мозг художников или композиторов. Также ли там прокладываются дорожки между клетками или как-то по-другому работает. Сейчас я переведу, спрошу Джона. John, what about artists and composers' brains? Does it work the same and the same way to build that pathways in the brain? Because it's not just a simple logical steps when they create music or, writing something. And is it the same way how it works inside the brains? Connections between brain cells and so on, or it's a different way, because sometimes creators, artists or composers, even can explain what happens with them when they are, in that in that flow and creating something.
No, that's a very, very, very interesting question. I think at a fundamental biological level, our brains work in the same way. It's all about making connections.
Это очень интересный вопрос, говорит Джон, даже очень-очень интересный. Но в целом на уровне таком биологическом все-таки работает мозг примерно одинаково, и это все о том, что создание вот этих связей между клетками мозга.
Now, I think that in the case of artists and writers and musicians and painters, what they have is they have the ability to make connections between ideas that may not necessarily be logically connected. And they do this using their imagination. Sorry.
Окей. В мозге, мозг художников, ну, тех, кто творческих людей, он способен создавать связи между такими идеями, которые, ну, в нашем понимании логически не должны были бы создаваться. То есть они используют свое воображение, чтобы создавать эти связи. Воображение помогает создавать эти связи между тем, что логически вроде бы не связано.
I mean, I'm a writer as well as an educator. And also I've spoken to many artists and writers, and I've read about this. And it does seem that creative people have the ability to make connections that people who aren't writers or wouldn't normally do. And this is why imagination and daydreaming are so important, I think, as part of the artistic process.
Джон не только занимается образованием, он еще и писатель, поэтому много общался с другими писателями, творческими людьми, много читал об этом. Говорит, что как раз творческим людям помогает что-то создавать, воображение, и когда они помогают создавать вот эти связи, которые трудно создать в мозгу, скажем так, нетворческого человека. Вот здесь на помощь приходит воображение, и то, что daydreaming – это когда, знаете, замерли и задумались о чем-то днем, такое сновидение не ночью, а днем, когда вы просто о чем-то задумались и немножко выпали из процесса. Наверное, так это можно перевести. Это тоже помогает творческим людям строить какие-то, в этот момент строятся какие-то связи, которые логически, казалось бы, трудно построить.
I'll give you an example, a good example. There's a famous English writer and historian, a man called Edward Gibbon, and he said that he thought of the creative process. It was like he was a spider sitting in an incredibly complicated web that linked together history, philosophy, art, music, sculpture. And he sat at the middle and took all these ideas and connected them in his art. And that's how he created, how he was creative.
Вот такой пример, что есть один известный писатель, историк английский, он говорит, что он так себе представляет творческий процесс, как будто это такой паук, который сидит в очень сложном таком паутине, и он соединяет, собирает информацию, данные из разных источников. Это может быть история, философия, музыка. Он это все соединяет между собой, и таким образом создается тот продукт творческого человека, то, что он создает. Thanks,
Okay.
John.
I'm not sure if that answers the question, but certainly I think that's a good explanation to me.
Yes, thank you so much. I think it's okay if I will ask the person who asked the question to let us know do you answer him or not. So, если мы ответили с Джоном, Джон ответил, а я перевела, и вы довольны ответом, тоже дайте нам знать. Сейчас я посмотрю еще вопросы. Okay? What do you want to say something, John?
No. Next question.
Or I can move and ask another one question. So the next question is about numbers. So may it be that numbers that brain do not want to think more about more than 4 ideas or 4 objects or 4 concepts, and is it an effect, not a reason, of having that counting system with 4 from 1 to 3 with the similar things 1 to 3, and is it a reason or is it an effect? What could you explain a bit more about numbers? And let me ask the question in Russian as well. Я задаю вопрос сейчас Джону про цифры. Является ли то, что мозг не желает обрабатывать больше 4 объектов, является ли это следствием, а не причиной. Это у нас созданы вот эти счетные системы от 1 до 3, кто Джон показывал, римская или японская, а уже для 4 цифры свой символ. Вот об этом вопрос. Sorry.
That's okay. It's about how quickly we can pass numbers. The term pass, it's the ability to instantly count a number of things. Now, we can instantaneously spot up to three things. Once we start to increase the number to 4 or 5 or 6 or more, what happens then is that it's almost like the energy level in here goes up, and it becomes hard. The brain has to do more work, which it doesn't really want to do that.
Ну, это скорее про скорость и распознавание чисел, как быстро мы можем считать. Одновременно мы можем три одновременно вещи мы можем легко обрабатывать. Как только мы думаем про 4, 5 и больше, мозгу нужно сильнее работать, повышается, нагревается двигатель, и мозг очень не хочет этого делать.
So that's an explanation as to why in those two counting systems, once it got to 4, instead of having 4 sticks, we had a symbol which represented 4, and then going and increasing numbers. If you actually look at the number of objects on the page, it tends to be never more than three physical things on a page, because then we start to, again, the energy is going up.
Поэтому мозгу трудно обрабатывать, и чтобы снизить вот эту энергию, у нас, если посмотреть на эти системы исчисления, то не 4 палочки, а новый символ, и там меньше объектов, потому что их легче распознавать мозгу, не нужно тратить много энергии.
Now, if the objects are arranged in a pattern, and the pattern is the same every time, and I'm thinking of dice, the spots on a dice, or the spots on dominoes, or the spots on playing cards. When you're playing cards, we can recognize the pattern. We see the pattern before we count the number, because that's quicker for us. Does that make sense?
Мозгу проще распознавать. Okay, I will try to translate.
Sorry.
Мозгу проще распознавать шаблоны. Когда мы играем, например, в домино или в карты, то мы сначала мозг распознает шаблон, а потом уже начинает считать. То есть он не понимает, что это там 10 написано, не распознает это как 10, а просто видит как определенный шаблон, который распознать легче, чем цифру.
Now, there's a very interesting experiment that has been done where you show people a collection of dots, of 100 dots, and then you show them a collection of 110 dots and ask them to say which is bigger. Now, for humans, that's difficult. It is difficult because we're having to process those individual dots.
Провели такой интересный эксперимент, показали набор точек, где было 100 точек, и вторую картинку, где было 110 точек, и спросили, где больше. И человеку очень трудно сказать сразу, где больше, для этого нужно посчитать, нужно пройти через эту процедуру, посчитать каждую индивидуальную точку.
But if you show those two groups of dots to a chimpanzee, the chimpanzee can do it immediately, instantly, much faster than a human. We have no idea why. We don't know why, but a chimp can process it quicker than a human.
Interesting. Если эти же самые карточки с группами точек показали шимпанзе, и они мгновенно определили там, где больше, выбрали нужную карточку, и мы пока не понимаем, почему почему мозг шимпанзе такие задачи обрабатывает гораздо-гораздо быстрее, чем мозг человека.
Yeah, it's very strange. But we don't know why.
Никто не знает пока почему, но вот еще есть над чем поработать науки, нейронауки. So I think we can move to another question now. And еще один вопрос, сначала на русском, потом на английском скажу. Что будет эффективней, если учителя интегрируют техники и приемы, основанные на достижении нейронауки в учебный процесс, или второй путь – предложить ученикам специальный модуль или курс для понимания, как эффективно учиться с помощью нейронауки? Какой путь будет эффективней? So, John, the question is about education and about two ways. Would you have an idea what way will be more efficient and the best way? The first one is to give teachers some techniques or some, templates how to teach students based on neuroscience achievements and all you talk about today. Or the second way is to explain students how to learn using neuroscience and using all that ideas, how their students' brain can be more efficient than without that knowledge. What's the way do you think will be the better, to give it to teacher's hand or to students?
Well, I think absolutely we should teach students these principles. There's a concept called metacognition for when you're dealing with students, which means that you're not just teaching them, you're not just helping them learn things, but you're also telling them how they learn, getting them to understand how they learn. And that is very, very important. So I think we need to introduce these techniques to teachers and students, but absolutely to students, so they become aware of how their brain works.
На самом деле, конечно, важно прежде всего рассказывать ученикам, как работает их мозг и как они учатся. Это очень важно. Есть такое понятие, как метапознание, которая будет работать, когда ученики будут понимать, как работает их мозг. Конечно, важно давать эти инструменты и знания учителям, но важнее даже объяснить ученикам, как они учатся, как работает их мозг, как они запоминают, и это поможет им. И учитель не просто передаст им знания, они сами смогут себе помочь учиться.
The other thing I was going to say is that although I've explained general principles, every individual is slightly different. And certainly the links and connections inside every person's mind is unique. So it's very important to give these tools to students so that they can create a mental landscape that is unique to them. And that's very important. I think that's very important.
Окей. Джон говорит, что он рассказывал об основных принципах, которые такие общие для всех, но на самом деле мозг каждого человека, каждый человек индивидуальный и уникальный, поэтому в каждой голове происходят свои процессы, они индивидуальны и уникальны для каждого. Поэтому, когда мы даем такие знания о том, как работает мозг ученику, то он строит свою уникальную систему, такой уникальный ландшафт в своей голове, но основанный на этих данных. Поэтому важно учить именно учеников, тогда он сможет создать такую индивидуальную свою собственную карту обучения. So, let me check. Here is a lot of questions here. What about different types of brains, if we can say, I mean female and male brains. And here is an opinion that women can do more than 3 things at the same time. Does it mean that the women's brain work in a different way? And I forgot to ask, it's in Russian language, let me do it, please. Вопрос про женский и мужской мозг. Различно ли воспринимание 3 элементов, ведь женщины могут делать несколько дел одновременно. Вот этот вопрос я уже задала Джону. So, what about the difference and multitasking
That's
of women?
multitasking. Yeah, you're talking about multitasking.
Yeah, and
The,
about women and men, if it is a difference or not.
there'll be differences. I'm not exactly sure. I don't know the details, because I think that at the kind of the level we're operating in the classroom, I don't think in young people particularly the differences are that significant. Sorry, do you want to translate that? And then I'll talk about multitasking.
Ну, вот если мы говорим про учеников, там, про учеников, про маленьких учеников, то здесь точно нет никакого различия, как работают мальчики и девочки. Здесь примерно одинаково все работает. Ну, сейчас Джон объяснит про мультизадачность.
There has been some research done on multitasking and whether it's possible. It's a bit of a myth. It's another neuro myth. The idea that you can do multiple things simultaneously. And the obvious example is given that women can do this better than men. That's usually because women have to do more things simultaneously than men because of what they have to do, the way their lives are organized. But it's a myth. It is a myth. You can try and do 2 or 3 things at once, but you're operating at less than 100% efficiency. Sorry, go on.
Okay, let me translate. Вообще проводились такие исследования мультизадачности, и вообще считается, что это миф, что на самом деле мультизадачность – это миф с точки зрения нейронауки. Женщины могут делать больше задач, выполнять, это такой стиль жизни, женщине всегда нужно выполнить больше задач, чем мужчине, такой образ жизни. Но если вы можете попытаться делать одновременно 2-3 дела, но ваша эффективность будет меньше, чем 100%, если одновременно делать несколько дел.
What is actually happening, what they found is actually happening with so-called multitasking is that your attention is switching. So you're never focused. You're never focused on 2 things at once, like, reading and looking at something on TV. What's happening is your attention is switching back and forth between the 2, back and forth, very quickly. That can appear to be multitasking, but it's not. And your attention and your comprehension is always going to be less than if you were concentrating on one thing.
Okay. Когда вы пытаетесь сделать несколько задач одновременно, то происходит то, что ваше внимание перепрыгивает с одного объекта на другой и обратно. То есть вы не концентрируетесь на чем-то одном, а очень быстро с одного на другой объект перепрыгиваете или с одной мысли на другую перепрыгиваете. Туда и обратно внимание перескакивает, но при этом вы никогда не сможете быть сфокусированы, сосредоточены на одном деле на 100%. Сосредоточенности, вовлеченности если вы делаете несколько задач одновременно, будет гораздо ниже, чем если бы вы делали их последовательно по одной задаче. Okay, I think it's a good answer. So let me look for the other questions. So that was a question about additional your lectures or presentations and where they can find more videos by John Collick. I can say that we can share all we have with Russian subtitles, and I will add links after, if you are okay with it.
Yeah, please do. No, please do. Yeah, please share, Anna, please share what you have. I'm always
Okay.
very happy. I'm always very happy to give presentations on neuroscience or other topics like game-based learning, the future of education, all these kind of topics. So I'm always very happy to give a presentation if people want to hear me again.
Окей. На вопрос, где найти еще лекции Джона Коллика, я после окончания эфира добавлю ссылки в чат и на все, что у нас есть с субтитрами или без субтитров на русском языке, и вы сможете посмотреть их после. И доктор Джон дал мне на это добро, так что я в ближайшее время это сделаю. У нас еще есть уточняющий вопрос и не очень много времени, так что смело задавайте вопросы. So, John, we have one additional question about that two ways to give that to teachers or neuroscience skills and neuroscience techniques to teachers or to students. And it's an additional question. If we're talking about students, should it be some special course for students, or should it be implemented in lessons, small modules, or how do you think what is should it be the special course for how to learn using neuroscience in
That's a good question.
first
I
grade?
think. I mean, if you can do it as a separate course, then that is a great benefit. You can introduce the subject in greater depth to students, but not all students may want that or need that. And also, that's adding another course to the school curriculum. I think it's probably easier and more useful to introduce these ideas to students in their regular classes, either by introducing the students to the concepts I think I think that's a better way of doing it. I think you'll get a quicker results rather than having every child suddenly then take a course in the topic, which I think would load the curriculum.
Окей. Ну, если есть возможность вести полный курс, то это было бы хорошо, тогда можно было бы глубоко внедриться в тему нейронауки, но эффективнее и быстрее получить результат можно будет, если использовать небольшие модули и внедрять в уроки вот эти объяснения, как работает мозг, чтобы не делать отдельным курсом, дополнительной нагрузкой на учеников и учителей. И у меня еще есть вопрос, который задавали до начала эфира. Я позволю его себе озвучить, хотя его нету в чате. So, John, I have one more question that was asked before we started. So it's not in the chat, but I will ask if you are okay with it. That not maybe directly connected to the topic of our webinar today, but some people get some investigation and knows that you are a writer, science fiction writer. And the question was, how do you think if any writers, skills or storytellers techniques could help in the lessons? For example, if you could help teachers in the lessons, for example, to add some drama to a lesson, will it be helpful or not? How do you think, if there are any ideas or any skills that writers have, will be helpful to teachers in the lessons? So that was a question.
No, I think so. I mean, I've only talked a little bit about some of the discoveries, but one of the discoveries is that human brains respond to stories. Stories are a very, very powerful way of communicating. Stories allow us to understand the principles of cause and effect, for example. But we also relate to stories. We relate to stories about people like us. Sorry, do you want to...
Я спросила Джона, вот перед началом эфира мне задали вопрос, потому что Джон еще и писатель, пишет научно-фантастические романы, и вопрос был в том, что могут ли навыки писательские или навыки рассказчика помочь в проведении уроков, быть полезными для учителя в проведении уроков, например, добавить драму или что-то такое. Вот Джон говорит, что проводились исследования, не очень много, но все-таки они показывают, что вообще человек и мозг человека очень хорошо реагируют на истории, когда они помогают понять причины и следствия лучше, и особенно хорошо работают истории, которые рассказывают о таких же людях, ну, как мы все, и это помогает лучше понять какую-то тему.
So I think, sorry, I was going to say, storytelling is an incredibly powerful educational tool. Not just telling children stories, but also teaching the students to tell their own stories or to tell stories about the subject that they are studying. It is incredibly useful.
Ну, очень мощный инструмент, это сторителлинг или по-русски рассказывание истории. И речь не только о том, чтобы учитель рассказывал истории ученикам, а о том, чтобы учить их рассказывать свои собственные истории, рассказывать истории о том предмете, который они сейчас изучают. Это очень мощный инструмент, который можно использовать в образовании, очень помогает в понимании.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Джон. Спасибо большое, Джон. Сейчас я проверю еще раз вопросы. Вроде бы вопросов больше нет. Я вижу, что у нас уже заканчивается время, даже, можно сказать, закончилось. Я позволю от всех нас сказать спасибо доктору Джону Коллику и спасибо всем слушателям, которые были сегодня, задавали вопросы. Если мы вдруг на какие-то не ответили, пишите, пожалуйста, в чате, ответим на них после эфира. So, John, thank you so much for your time and for your amazing presentation today and your answers, because it was very interesting question. So thank you to our audience for that questions as well.
Absolutely.
And hope we'll meet next time with more questions and more answers, looking what will happen new in the neuroscience, because it's science that is still not the final stage of neuroscience. So hope next time we'll get more answers. And thank you so much. Спасибо большое Джону, я передала от всех нас, и спасибо большое нам всем за то, что мы были и задавали вопросы.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure. And please, if anybody has any further questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. I'm happy to hear your ideas. Thank you so much.
Спасибо всем большое, говорит Джон. Он очень рад, что вы пригласили его. И если есть какие-то вопросы, он всегда открыт на то, чтобы подискутировать, ответить на них. Так что смело можете написать мне или Джону, или через Педсовет с нами связаться. Мы всегда готовы поддержать дискуссию, ответить на вопросы. Я тогда